Well, good morning. It is Wednesday, March 24th, and we are gathered for morning devotion, and we are using again N.T. Wright's book, Lent for Everyone. Today's passage is from Mark 12, verses 18 through 44, and I invite you to read that, but the focus is 18 through 27, and that is what I'm going to read. Some Sadducees approached Jesus. Sadducees, by the way, deny the resurrection. Teacher, they said, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife but no children, the brother should take the wife and raise up descendants for his brothers. Well now, there was once 7 brothers. The first married a wife and died without children. The second married a widow and died without children. The third did so as well. And so did all 7, still without leaving children. Finally, the woman died too. So, when they rise again in the resurrection, whose wife should she be? After all, 7 had her, after all. Where you're going wrong, Jesus replies, is that you don't know the scripture or God's power. When people rise from the dead, they don't marry, nor do people give them in marriage. They are all angels in heaven. However, to show you that the dead are indeed to be raised, surely you've read the book of Moses. In the passage about the bush, what God says, I am Abraham's God, Isaac's God, Jacob's God. He isn't the God of the dead, but the living. You are completely mistaken. James stared at the machine doubtful. I don't know, he said. Looks quite clever, but I don't see how it could actually work. His brother, who had spent all winter building a new machine, they were farmers and needed a better way of harvesting their crops, turned to him with a smile. You're forgetting one thing, he said. The new fuel they're producing. It's much lighter than diesel or petrol. Yes, it would never work with the old stuff, but if you just wait, with the new fuel, it'll do everything we need and more. The missing ingredient, actually, in Jesus' debate with the Sadducees, was the 2 missing ingredients. In addition to the power, God's power, which have been conveniently left out of the question, there was also the writings, the scriptures. But didn't the Sadducees know the scriptures? Weren't they the official guardians of the whole ancestral tradition? The aristocracies were supposed to be looking for the very heart of Judaism? How come they were, from Jesus' point of view, so far off? This will also answer the question of some might ask, why does this odd little story appear at this point in the first place? Mark 11 and 12 are just a collection of debates that Jesus happened to have in his final days of Jerusalem. Then they relate in one way or another to the question of the kingdom. Just what was going to happen when God became king, and how would this relate to the world they were living in at the time? Here's the clue. The Sadducees were the powerful elite in Jerusalem. Like most elite groups, they hugged power close to themselves. They were deeply suspicious of any radical movement that suggested that things were going to be changed or turned upside down. That's why they opposed the teachings of the resurrection, which was popular with the Pharisees, because resurrection, God bringing people back to life, again, to people to a new world, meant a root and branch transformation for the whole world. There was no guarantee that those presently in power would retain the power in the new world. In fact, as Jesus had been saying frequently, there was every likelihood that those in front would end up at the back, or vice versa. The people started believing this sort of thing. The Sadducees reckoned there was no knowing what they might do or go. So the Sadducees did what people today will do when they want to rubbish an idea they are frightened of. Tell silly stories to show how ridiculous it is. So the Sadducees produced a story about a woman with 7 husbands. At the resurrections, whose wife will she be? They have forgotten the missing ingredient, the writings or the scripture and the power of God. The whole point of the resurrection, Jesus insists, is that it isn't just a coming back into the present life with marrying and childbearing. It's God's new world. Those who rise from the dead will be, in that respect, like the angels. They won't need to marry because there will be no more death, no need for more children. God is the creator. He is not limited to the possibilities of the present corruptible world. This too is taught in the scriptures. If you know where to look. The Sadducees, deeply conservative as they were suspicious of the latter books of the Bible and concentrated only on the first 5. Very well, said Jesus, let's go there. What do you find? We find God declaring to Moses that he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we know he is the God of the living and not of the dead. What does this mean? That Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob have already been raised from the dead? Certainly not. Resurrection never meant going to heaven or living in the presence of God. It meant new bodies. But if people were going to be given new bodies, that meant that between their death and their eventual resurrection, they were still, in fact, alive in some sense in the presence of God. Jesus, like the Pharisees, in this respect, taught us 2-stage life after death. First, a time of being with God, alive in his presence, but not yet re-embodied, and then, after all, the newly embodied life of resurrection itself. This is a stunning piece of teaching, as the legal experts who now approach Jesus in verse 28 realize. It not only reaffirms the great truth that God has prepared for his people a far more glorious future than most of them ever imagined, it also strongly reaffirms the rightness of what Jesus was doing in the temple. God was launching through Jesus his sovereign, saving rule, and everything was indeed going to be turned upside down. The Sadducees' power base, the temple, was going to be overthrown, and God was going to set up Jesus himself and his followers as the new radical alternative. This would be a bit like resurrection in advance, God's new life on earth as in heaven. Sounds a bit dubious. You're forgetting the missing ingredient, the scriptures and God's power. And so just a quick recap here. I don't really totally get what N.T. Wright is getting at in this passage. So the Sadducees, come with this so ridiculous story. A woman has 7 wives and no children, and you heard the story. Who is her husband in the end? And Jesus basically says, does it really matter? Why does that even matter? Because when God raises everybody up, when everybody's together, it doesn't really matter. There will be no more marriage, no reason for that anymore. And so he goes on this little tangent about, this 2 stages of death and everything, which is what, the people at that time believed. And some people today even believe. I struggle with trying to figure some of this out. I've read several of his books on that and still struggle with that. But the point is, we are going to be raised to a new heaven and a new earth. We're going to be raised to something glorious. So the trite little trivial things about, the story of the 7 husbands doesn't really matter. We're all going to be in God's glory. We're all going to be together in that place where God is with us. And that is all that should really matter. So go forth this day in the peace and the love of Christ. And we'll see you tomorrow.